that were hijacked and brought down, and there's been no mention yet of anything about guns being used. But first, let's look at the facts of these crashes today. The string of events that results in these 4 horrific crashes begins at Boston's Logan Airport, 7:45 a.m. American Flight 11, 767, with 92 on board, supposed to fly Boston to Los Angeles, but over New York State, it's diverted, forced to fly south, directly into the North Tower of the World Trade Center. A long day of carnage is underway. Back in Boston, United Flight 175, another 767, with 65 aboard, is already in the air, also bound for Los Angeles, 15 minutes behind the first flight, when it too is hijacked. This, the actual plane, as it hits the South Tower of the World Trade Center. 8:10 a.m., American Flight 77, a 757 with 64 aboard, has taken off from Washington's Dulles Airport, also bound for Los Angeles. It too taken over and loops back into the Pentagon. It slices in at an angle, leaving a deadly and ugly gash in the nation's military nerve center. And finally, 8 a.m. out of Newark Airport, United's Flight 93, a 757 with 45 aboard, bound Newark to San Francisco, hijacked as well, but crashes short of whatever its intended target is, comes down in rural western Pennsylvania. Eyewitnesses there.
And I heard a loud noise, and I happened to look up, and it was a plane. It was real low to me. It sounded like it was running fine to me. I just kept watching. I watched it go nosedive straight into the ground.
You could see where the plane made the initial impact in the ground, and it was still on fire. It made a crater probably 30 feet by 30 feet, and it's probably 15 or 20 feet deep, and there's just debris scattered within probably a half-a-mile radius.
There are only 2 ways terrorists can sneak themselves or their weapons aboard planes, either through passenger screening or by going unscreened through locked doors into off-limits areas or onto the tarmac. Periodic FAA tests have found plenty of flaws. Found when government agents tried to sneak into secure areas, they were successful more than 2/3 of the time. Found testers also often able to sneak fake guns and explosives by X-ray screening. Once aboard, many speculate the hijackers must have disabled crews and taken over the plane's controls. More likely that than forcing a pilot with a gun at his head to fly right into the World Trade Center, for instance. Former American Airlines pilot Jim Tillman.
It is inconceivable to me that any airline pilot would allow anyone to force him to fly into an inhabited building. I cannot imagine how any pilot could be conscious or capable of doing anything to control that airplane at the time that it was directed at one of these buildings.
Terrorism specialist Neil Livingstone.
I suspect that what we're going to find is that the pilots were overwhelmed, perhaps dead already, and that trained pilots from the hijacker camp were in charge of those aircraft and were willing to die for their beliefs.
If there was time, if there was, the crews may have been able to press a button in the cockpit and send out a coded warning to controllers that there was a hijack in progress. Controllers may then have radioed back inquiries. But if the crews were disabled, the controllers would have been left in the dark for real information. Whatever else, controllers must have been surprised, in disbelief. There hadn't been a commercial plane hijacked in the U.S. for 10 years, since 1991. And now this. And tonight we're getting reports of cell phone calls from at least 3 of those 4 flights, 1 from a flight attendant and 2 from passengers that were on board the flights. And they all talk about knives. There's, again, no mention of guns. In the first case, it was that flight that came out of Boston, and that was an American Airlines flight, and it was a flight attendant who apparently got a cell phone call off. I've heard variously it was to American Airlines operations or maybe somewhere else, but she reported that her fellow attendants had been stabbed in the back of the plane, and that the cabin had been taken over, and up front that the crew of the plane had been taken over, and that the plane was going down in New York, was the quote that we heard. Then, on the second flight that came out of Boston, that was the second flight of the day, that was 17 minutes behind that first flight, and also went into one of the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center, there was a businessman who got off 2 cell phone calls to his father. In the first call, he told his father that a flight attendant had been stabbed and the plane had been hijacked. Then the phone went dead. Then he got another call off to his father and said the plane was going down. So that, again, is a plane that went into the second Twin Tower of the World Trade Center. On the third third flight of the day to be hijacked. The one that left from Dulles Airport was supposed to go to San Francisco. Instead was taken over, looped around, brought back to the Pentagon. It was Barbara Olson, the CNN commentator and Washington lawyer and the wife of Solicitor General Theodore Olson, who called her husband Theodore twice from the plane before it went down. I'm sorry, I think she called once, but she talked about knife-like instruments being used by the hijackers in the back of the plane, and said that passengers had been forced to the back of the plane. Anyhow, all this talk about knives might suggest that something managed to get through X-rays, and maybe it was thought by the terrorists that it would be easier to get knives through the X-ray machines and not be caught at it than to get guns through. At any rate, we may hear differently later, but so far there's been no mention of guns. Tom?
All right, thank you very much, NBC's Robert Hager tonight with a complete wrap-up of the aviation component of